Today I am interviewing the Reverend Mary Kearns, who is a chaplain at Enloe Hospice. And among her many skills and qualifications, she specializes in grief and traumatic grief. So, Mary, not many weeks ago, we observed the 2-year anniversary of the campfire, and this past summer, several more fires that were not far from the campfire ripped through the county as well. And we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder as it relates to folks who have been traumatized and even re-traumatized by the first fire. But how does it relate to grief? Because it seems like PTSD and grief aren't even related to each other.
Oh, well, that's not true. PTSD and traumatic grief are very closely related. They share a lot of the same symptoms. They share a lot of the same triggers, and they also benefit from some of the same modalities to lessen the effects of them. The campfire was a traumatic event. It was a level 3 traumatic event, a natural disaster. And it changed people's lives. It took lives. It changed the scope and landscape of the community of Paradise and Concow and Butte County and Chico. And the impact of it continues to this day. The trauma associated with that day is still lingering, and the big reason for that is whenever a human being experiences trauma, it shuts everything down. It gets stored in the body and it gets stored in the brain. People go into survival mode, or lizard brain is in charge, and it's fight or flight, and it's just about survival. So what happened and why people are feeling triggered naturally by the other fires that happen, and why people are still very devastated and very hurt by the campfire is this phenomenon that happens with any person who suffers PTSD, and that's called the delayed response. So the event happened on November 8th, 2018. And in the 9 months to 12 months after the fire, people were consumed with just the very basics: survival, finding shelter, finding food, finding places to go back to work, trying to get their kids back into school. So all of this focus of energy was on your basic survival. So 9 months to 12 months beyond the event, around the time of the anniversary, people started talking to me and saying, why am I starting to feel the effects of that day again? I thought, since I had so much time and distance from the event, it would have softened, but it didn't. If anything, it became even more acute, and that is because people, usually 9 months to 12 months out from the event, they had their housing, they had started getting back to normal, and then all of the trauma that happened that day that was stored in their body and their brain is starting to bubble up. And so people came to me saying, my dreams, I keep dreaming about that day. I can't get out of it. People are like, I hear a sound, any sound of a fire engine, and I break out into a cold sweat and tremors. And there were lots of different triggers going out there. I mean, campfire, regular campfires during the summertime, the smell of smoke, people's heightened sense was still there. And so they were consumed with getting settled. We had the anniversary, and then all of a sudden the feelings started pouring out. And people thought they were literally going crazy.
And what timeline are we talking? You said
at about
six.
a year out. They thought they would be getting better. So from 2019 to 2020, what people who survived that fire are doing now is catch up. And that catch up is through expressing the emotions and the fear and the terror of that day.
Right.
And learning to recognize that they have triggers now
Yeah.
that weren't there before,
Right.
but now they very much are. And that's some of the things that we were seeing and experiencing when we were running the support groups
Right.
with Resilience Resources, is people were having to do what's called catch-up mourning
Right.
of the traumatic event.
Yeah. Well, I hear so many people saying, why aren't you over that? That was 2 years ago.
Mhm.
That must be frustrating for people who
Mhm.
are just now having that catch up.
Right. Well, that first year didn't count.
Mm.
Emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, that first year for a lot of folks, it didn't count.
Mm-hmm.
They were so consumed with just survival, they didn't have time to process the feelings.
Right.
Whether it was folks who lost loved ones in the fire, or relocating. Some of the folks I have encountered in my day job as a hospice chaplain, they were survivors of the fire, and they had to relocate to some of our outlying communities.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought, wow, if I relocate to the outlying communities and get away from it, I'll be okay. And they weren't okay.
Yeah.
They were not okay. And they needed to talk about it, and other triggers were happening in their life, and they just kept saying, wow, this is still a big thing. And another sad impact is we went through the Camp Fire, one of the most devastating fires in the history of the U.S.
Yeah.
And other folks will say, oh yeah, my house burned down when I was 5. I know exactly what you're going through.
Mm-hmm.
And so people minimize what we all went through that day, and that doesn't help at all. Not at all. You really need to stick to people who went through the same event to get the same kind of empathy and compassion for it. I can't talk to someone who survived Hurricane Katrina
Right.
and offer a similar experience. I can offer listening, and I can offer just, wow, you went through a horrific experience. I'm sorry. How can I be of service to you? It's a natural disaster, but it's a different event.
Sure.
So, yeah.
How long do you think this is going to have an impact on this community?
As far as grief timelines go and PTSD timelines go, PTSD can, unless there's identification of triggers, unless there's identification of the trauma, unless there's active mourning, unless there is therapy and group talk, it can last a lifetime.
Right.
But as far as grief, a normal grief timeline, let's say just your mom passes away or your cousin passes away, a normal grief timeline is 18 months to 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's normal.
Right.
You throw trauma in there and you've lengthened it, because trauma takes time to recover. It takes time to soften, and it softens through expression. It softens through being in groups with people of like similarity. That's why, support groups are so therapeutically beneficial
Mm-hmm.
for folks who go through that, because it's people who all went through the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, when we had the groups, people in here were like, everyone in this room gets it. We all know what we went through. And that empathy and that bond is huge, to be understood. When we're grieving, when we are traumatized, our need to be understood is way up here.
Mm-hmm.
And our ability to deal with frustration or any setback is way down here. Our filters are gone.
Yeah.
And that's what traumatic grief and that's what PTSD does. It strips us of our filters.
Okay. Well, while we're on the subject of PTSD, not everyone who experiences the same trauma or traumatic event develops PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
So are there some people who are more predisposed to PTSD than others?
I'm not going to say predisposed.
Okay.
I'm going to say life circumstance
Mm-hmm.
probably had a huge thing to do with that. not everyone who experienced the fire, that wasn't their only PTSD.
Ah,
When immediately after it happened, and I was doing chaplain work with Shalom Free Clinic, and we were going into the shelters, I had veterans of foreign wars who were there, Vietnam and Iran and Iraq, and just they were like, this was another trauma. So other people had additional PTSD before that event even happened.
sure.
And some of the folks who went through my group had, really horrific childhoods. And so they you already had people dealing with tremendous loss. We even had people who got burned out from the fires down in the Napa area, and they had relocated up to Paradise.
Oh, and the car fire too.
And the
I
car
remember a
fire.
woman from Reading who, yeah.
And they got burned out twice.
Yeah.
So it's not that someone's weak if they develop PTSD from this event. It's
Right.
that, again, they're a normal person experiencing an abnormal event. It's classified as a level 3 trauma, a natural disaster trauma. So if anyone is having PTSD or traumatic grief associated with this, you're a normal person who has gone through an abnormal experience, and you're not a bad person or you're not weak, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And the last thing about that, the resilience and recovery from this, gets down to basic economics. Some folks had insurance and resources and were able to recover within a year and a half.
Sure.
And there are still, by the last count I heard, over 2,000 people displaced
Yeah.
in our community, in our county, from the fire. So having resources to deal with the PTSD
Yeah.
is, part of the equation here too.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that there are some people who came off the hill. As they're coming down the hill, immediately they came down here and secured housing because they had the resources for them. But people who haven't, that's a different story. So, okay, what word of hope can you offer a person who is experiencing trauma and grief?
I think the thing that I heard the most when people came in to this group and the number one question they always asked me was, Chaplain Mary, am I going crazy? And my answer was no. You are a normal human being who experienced a traumatic event that was stored in your body. You are starting to process that, and it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes a tremendous amount of time and self-compassion and understanding, just identifying the fact that living through a natural disaster is traumatic. The world has moved on, and our county is still rebuilding.
Yeah.
The city of Paradise is rebuilding. People are rebuilding their lives, and this takes time.
Right.
And so the number one thing of hope I can just give is, like, you're not going crazy.
Yeah.
This was a terrible, terrible event, and it takes time.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mary. I appreciate the time that you gave today, and I appreciate the wisdom and knowledge that you brought.